And the never-ending stream of nightmare fuel continues, doesn't it, dear frenemies? Here we have an article from Time magazine, and I'm going to read through this entire article. I'm sure there are many out there that would just link you to the article and let you see for yourself, but I feel that this is something that needs to be documented. As you can see by the very title itself, the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. Who would have thought? Just the title itself is very interesting. The editors at Time magazine wanting to promote this event as a good thing. What hubris. Now, dear friend of me, I can tell you from personal experience that I myself have acted under delusion that you must do something wrong in order to do something right. But I was wrong. So, let us go through this article together. I will read, and we will decide, me for myself, and you for yourself. A weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. As President Trump refused to concede, the response was not a mass action but crickets. When media organizations called the race for Joe Biden on November 7th, jubilation broke out instead as people thronged cities across the U.S. to celebrate the democratic process that resulted in Trump's ouster. I remember a little differently, but let's continue. And yes, you can see I was looking at hats. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempts to reverse the result. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede. To the president, something felt amiss. It was all very, very strange, Trump said on December 2nd. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. Oh, let's see what way. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests, and coordinated the resistance from the CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact that formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. The spin in this article is dizzying. The handshake between business and labor on this was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free and fair, credible and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attacks from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. Though much of this activity took place on the left, it was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, with crucial contributions by nonpartisan and conservative actors. The scenario the shadow campaigners were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory. It was an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all, a failure of the central active democratic self-governance that has been a hallmark of America since its founding. Let's stop right here and talk about what we've read so far. So Time magazine is saying that Trump was right in that the election, let's see the words again. An orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. So Trump was basically saying that a winner is being picked, not voted on. And here, the Time magazine article is saying that the winner was effectively being picked to prevent a winner from being picked instead of voting on. This does not compute. Let's ask the question, just in case you think the wording here is a little bit ambiguous. Why would they say in the article that Trump was right in that a winner was being picked if later in the article they are trying to say that democracy was being protected? Let's continue reading. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws to help secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and used data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count could unfold over days and weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. After Election Day, they monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the result. The untold story of the election is the thousands of peoples of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, says Norm Eisen, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. Skew the narrative. Tell people what to believe. That's all that's being said in this paragraph. They're admitting that that's what they did. Trump's conspiracy theories. How is a conspiracy theory when you just admitted that Trump was telling the truth? It never ceases to amaze me, the hubris of criminals. But this, dear frenemies, is the nature of sociopaths. Now, we all want to be proud of our accomplishments. That's just human nature. But when your accomplishments are for your own beliefs and not for the people in general, are they really accomplishments? After all, who are you to be the arbiter of someone else's good fortune? Who am I to be the arbiter of someone else's good fortune? I am not. I am a misanthrope. I am perfectly happy seeing the world eat itself, seeing all of you let your beliefs control you and destroy yourselves and one another. And in the meantime, I laugh and poke fun. And just simply point out the plain and simple truths. But it's so important to act on one's beliefs, isn't it, dear frenemy? You see, dear frenemy, why would I point out the truth? You're probably asking, why would I point out the truth if I dislike people so much? Why would I present people with situations and let them decide for themselves if I dislike people so much? Well, the answer to that is rather simple. I enjoy watching people's hubris. As you may or may not know, I used to teach. And teaching can be such a sweet pleasure. Because for me, dear frenemy, There is no greater joy than to simply allow a person to have all the information they need to do whatever task they desire, and let them choose the task that is least beneficial for them. Let them choose the action that comes to harm them in some way on their own volition without any input from myself. I simply like to open all doors and watch people choose the wrong one. It's my exquisite pleasure in life. I'm not the one making the decisions. I'm simply the one pointing out every single piece of information I can. But, no. That's the wrong thing now, isn't it? People have to be protected from themselves. I prefer to let nature take its course. But let's go on with the idea of protecting people from themselves, shall we? Trump and his allies were running their own campaigns to spoil the election. The president spent months insisting that mail ballots were a Democratic plot and the election would be rigged. You know, the mostly Democratic judges in the Supreme Court said the same thing not too long ago. Just let's be clear. His henchmen at the state level sought to block their use, while his lawyers brought dozens of spurious suits to make it more difficult to vote, an intensification of the GOP's legacy of suppressive tactics. Let's be honest, this is something that both the DNC and the RNC do. Let's not forget the votes of Bernie Sanders. Before the election, Trump plotted to block a legitimate vote count, and he spent the months following November 3rd trying to steal the election he'd lost, with lawsuits and conspiracy theories, pressure on state and local officials, and finally summoning his army of supporters to the January 6th rally that ended in deadly violence at the Capitol. Oh, please. This article is laying it on thick. This is very, very propagandy. And yes, apparently that's a new word, propagandy. It may be a word already. I don't care. Let's continue reading. The democracy campaigners watched with alarm. Every week we felt like we were in a struggle to try to pull off this election without the country going through a real dangerous moment of unraveling, says former GOP Representative Zach Wamp, a Trump supporter who helped coordinate a bipartisan election protection council. We can look back and say this thing went pretty well, but it was not at all clear in September and October that that was going to be the case. Look at all the sheep who obey. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election. Based on access to the group's inner workings, never before seen documents and interviews with dozens of those involved from across the political spectrum, it is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. This article is a revelation of the nation in disaster. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated, says Ian Bassin, co-founder of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan rule of law advocacy group. Except it wasn't a rule of law in this election, was it, Time magazine? That's what you are stating in this article. But it's massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not self-executing. Yes, it is. That is why it is called democracy. The amount of rhetoric is literally making my head spin at this point. I literally have a headache from all the bullshit and propagandized terms in this article. This article is literally telling you that they are the arbiters of democracy. But if there is an arbiter to democracy, then it's not democracy. Now, is there? That's why the participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told. Even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, and steer media coverage to control the flow of information. That is what I call a dystopian nightmare. And if you do not believe by the revelation in this article that we live in a dystopian nightmare, then, well, I never thought there was saving you in the first place, dear frenemy. But let's continue. They were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. That is called rigging. To fortify something is also rigging. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to assure that democracy in America endures. That is called being an adult, is understanding that everything is fragile. There are no easy answers in life. There are no easy decisions. There are no short up defenses. Everything in life changes on a whim, just like the wind. But we live in an age of children that spawn nightmare fuel, don't we? The architect. Sometime in the fall of 2019, Mike Podhorzer became convinced the election was headed for disaster and determined to protect it. Just to point out, if you don't understand why I am saying all these things about the article, I will point to the fact that there is a lot of ambiguous terminology in this article. Ambiguity tends to hide nefarious nature. This was not his usual purview. For nearly a quarter century, Podhorzer, senior advisor to the president of the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest union federation, has marshaled the latest tactics and data to help its favored candidates win elections. Unassuming and professional, he isn't the sort of hair-gelled political strategist who shows up on cable news. Among Democratic Insider, he's known as the wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of liberal strategists he brought together in the early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the funding of Catalyst, a flagship progressive data company. I'll let you research these on your own. The endless chatter in Washington about political strategy, Podhorzer believes, has little to do with how well change really gets made. My basic take on politics is that it's all pretty obvious if you don't overthink it or swallow the prevailing frameworks whole, he once wrote. After that, just relentlessly identify your assumptions and challenge them. Podhorzer applies that approach to everything. When he coached his now adult son's Little League team in the D.C. suburbs, he trained the boys not to swing at most pitches, a tactic that infuriated both their and their opponents' parents, but won the team a series of championships. Trump's election in 2016, credited in part to his unusual strength among the sort of blue-collar white voters who once dominated the AFL-CIO, prompted Podhorzer to question his assumptions about voter behavior. He began circulating weekly number crunching memos to a small circle of allies and hosting strategy sessions in D.C. But when he began to worry about the election himself, he didn't want to seem paranoid. It was only after months of research that he introduced his concerns in his newsletter in October 2019. The usual tools of data, analytics, and polling would not be sufficient in a situation where the president himself was trying to disrupt the election, he wrote. Most of our planning takes us through Election Day, he noted, but we are not prepared for the two most likely outcomes, Trump losing and refusing to concede, and Trump winning the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote, by corrupting the voting process in key states. We desperately need to systematically red team this election so that we can anticipate and plan for the worst we know will be coming our way. I would like to know what evidence that Mr. Podhorzer had that Trump would be corrupting the voting process in key states. Because by the admission of this article, that is what the DNC did. So how does it make it right for one person to do it and not right for the other person to do it? It turned out Podhorzer wasn't the only one thinking in these terms. He began to hear from others eager to join forces. To fight the Fight Back table, a coalition of resistance organizations had begun scenario planning around the potential for a contested election, gathering liberal activists at the local and national level into what they called the Democracy Defense Coalition. Voting rights and civil rights organizations were raising alarms. A group of former elected officials was researching emergency powers they feared Trump might exploit. Protect Democracy was assembling a bipartisan election crisis task force. It turned out that once you said it out loud, people agreed, Podhorzer says, and it started building momentum. Said what out loud? He spent months pondering scenarios and talking to experts. It wasn't hard to find liberals who saw Trump as a dangerous dictator, but Podhorzer was careful to steer clear of hysteria. The media shows otherwise. I don't mean in Podhorzer's case, I'm just saying the hysteria in general. That's all we've been seeing for the past however many years is hysteria. What he wanted to know was not how American democracy was dying, but how it might be kept alive. The chief difference between U.S. and countries and that lost their grip on democracy, he concluded, was that America's decentralized election system couldn't be rigged in one fell swoop. That presented an opportunity to shore it up. What in the hell are they even talking about here? This is so backwards doublespeak nonsense. The chief difference between the U.S. and countries that lost their grip on democracy was because the U.S. was removing other countries' grips on democracy. And a decentralized system, if it couldn't be rigged, then why would it need to be shored up? And again, to shore it up is the same thing as rigging it. You're changing it. On March 3rd, Podhorzer drafted a 3-page confidential memo titled Threats to the 2020 Election. Trump has made it clear that this will not be a fair election, and he will reject anything but his own re-election as fake and rigged, he wrote. On November 3rd, should the media report otherwise, he will use the right-wing information system to establish his narrative and incite his supporters to protest. The memo laid out 4 categories of challenges: attacks on voters, attacks on election administration, attack on Trump's political opponents, and efforts to reverse the results of the election. Then COVID-19 erupted at the height of the primary election season. Normal methods of voting were no longer safe for voters or the mostly elderly volunteers who normally staff polling places. But political disagreements intensified by Trump's crusade against mail voting prevented some states from making it easier to vote absentee and for jurisdictions to count those votes in a timely manner. Chaos ensued. Ohio shut down in-person voting for its primary, leading to a minuscule turnout. A poll worker shortage in Milwaukee, where Wisconsin's heavily Democratic black population is concentrated, left just 5 open polling places, down from 182. In New York, vote counting took more than a month. Suddenly, the potential for a November meltdown was obvious. In his apartment in the D.C. suburbs, Podhorzer began working from his laptop at his kitchen table, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts across the progressive universe, the labor movement, the institutional left, like Planned Parenthood and Greenpeace, resistance groups like Indivisible and Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state-level grassroots organizers, and racial justice activists and others. In April, Podhorser began hosting weekly 2.5 hour Zoom. A weekly 2.5 hour Zoom. It was structured around a series of rapid-fire 5-minute presentations on everything from which ads were working to messaging to legal strategy. The invitation-only gatherings soon attracted hundreds, creating rare shared base of knowledge for the fractious progressive movement. I like how they're calling it a progressive movement here. That doesn't seem strange at all, now does it? At the risk of talking trash about the left, there's not a lot of good information sharing, says Anat Schenker Osario, a close Podhorser friend whose poll-tested messaging guidance shaped the group's approach. There's a lot of not invented here syndrome where people won't consider a good idea if they didn't come up with it. I could say the same about people's reaction to Trump. The meetings became the galactic center for a constellation of operatives across the left who shared overlapping goals but didn't usually work in concert. The group had no name, no leaders, and no hierarchy, but it kept the desperate actors in sync. I just have to think about this for a second. The group had no leaders and no hierarchy, yet Podhorser is the one that's spearheading all of this. That seems strange, but let's go on. Pod played a critical behind-the-scenes role in keeping different pieces of the movement infrastructure and communication and aligned, says Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. You have the litigation space, the organizing space, the political people just focused on the W, and their strategies aren't always aligned. He allowed this ecosystem to work together. Protecting the election would require an effort of unprecedented scale. As 2020 progressed, it stretched to Congress, Silicon Valley, and the nation's state houses. It drew energy from the summer's racial justice protests, many of whose leaders were a key part of the Liberal Alliance, and it eventually reached across the aisle into the world of Trump-skeptical Republicans appalled by his attacks on democracy. Securing the vote. The first task was overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic. For the thousands of local, mostly nonpartisan officials who administer elections, the most urgent need was money. They needed protective equipment like masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer. They needed to pay for postcards, letting people know they could vote absentee, or in some states, mail ballots to every voter. They needed additional staff and scanners to process ballots. In March, activists appealed to Congress to steer COVID relief money to election administration. Led by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, more than 150 organizations signed a letter to every member of Congress seeking a $2 billion in election funding. It was somewhat successful. The CARES Act, passed later that month, contained $400 million in grants to state election administrators. But the next tranche of relief funding didn't add to that number. It wasn't going to be enough. Private philanthropy stepped into the breach. An assortment of foundations contributed tens of millions in election administration and funding. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative chipped in $300 million. It was a failure at the federal level that 250,000 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs, says Amber McReynolds, a former Denver election official who heads the nonpartisan National Vote at Home Institute. McReynolds, a 2-year-old organization, became a clearinghouse for a nation struggling to adapt. The institute gave secretaries of state, both parties, technical advice on everything from which vendors use to how to locate drop boxes. Local officials are the most trusted sources of election information, but few can afford a press secretary, so the Institute distributed communication toolkits. In a presentation to Podhorser's group, McReynolds detailed the importance of absentee ballots for shortening lines at polling places and preventing election crisis. Now, all this that I've just read here, some of it sounds fine and dandy. Get the voters protective equipment. Sure, why not? I'm more interested in what's not being said. As I tell all my students, whenever you read or whenever you listen to somebody, you have to listen for 3 things. What's being said, how it's being said, and what's not being said. So far, what I'm reading about the actual actions here, just seems like a bunch of on the surface stuff, the fluff meant to put people at ease. But let's continue. The Institute's work helped 37 states and DC bolster mail voting, but it wouldn't be worth much if people didn't take advantage. Part of the challenge was logistical. Each state has different rules for when and how ballots should be requested and returned. The Voter Participation Center, which in a normal year would have deployed canvassers door to door to get out the vote, instead conducted focus groups in April and May to find out what would get people to vote by mail. In August and September, it sent ballot applications to 15 million people in key states, 4.6 million of whom returned them. In mailings and digital ads, the group urged people not to wait for Election Day. All the work we have done for 17 years was to build this moment of bringing democracy to people's doorsteps, says Tom Lepak, the center CEO. The effort had overcome heightened skepticism in some communities. Many black voters preferred to exercise their franchise in person and didn't trust the mail. I can understand why. And I'm not talking about the voting system in general. I'm talking about the communities, what happens there in the mail. National civil rights groups worked with local organizations to get the word out that this was the best way to ensure one's vote was counted. In Philadelphia, for example, advocates distributed voting safety kits containing mask, hand sanitizer, and informational brochures. We had to get the message out that this is safe, reliable, and you can trust it, says Hannah Fried of All Voting is Local. But the Supreme Court said years ago that you can't. I wouldn't trust it. Here is the reason why voting by mail is such a bad prospect. Let me put it this way. There's the old saying that too many cooks spoil the pot. What that means is that the more hands that get involved in anything, the more there is a chance for something to go wrong, or, in the case of food, people adding their own different tastes. People doing things their own different way, which, as I just stated, means that things can go wrong because the dish might not turn out correctly. In the case of voting by mail, well, now you're taking the information from a person, putting it through the post office, and all the people at the post office, and then it has to go to the ballot center and then go through all the normal steps there. You're inserting more points of failure. Also, the one thing that voting by mail does not, what's the word I'm looking for? The one thing that voting by mail does not prevent is accountability. When you go in and vote, you account for yourself. If you vote by mail, yes, mail by vote, that's a very interesting concept. But if you vote by mail, then the accountability becomes less. At the same time, Democratic lawyers battled a historic tie of pre-election litigation. The pandemic intensified as parties' usual tangling in the courts, but the lawyers noticed something else as well. The litigation brought by the Trump campaign of a piece with the broader campaign to sow doubt about mail voting was making novel claims and using theories no court has ever accepted, says Wendy Weiser, the voting rights expert at the Brennan Center for the Justice at NYU. Which theories were these? Was it the theory that mail-in voting is not a good idea? Because as I just said, a court did accept that theory. They read more like lawsuits designed to send a message rather than achieve a legal outcome. Again, this article is not giving any specifics. In the end, nearly half the electorate cast ballots by mail in 2020, practically a revolution in how people vote. About a quarter voted early in person. About only a quarter of voters cast their ballots in a traditional way, in person on Election Day. You know, I'm almost at the point where I say we take voting to the blockchain and see what happens there. But that would require a lot of work yet. Bad actors spreading false information is nothing new. You mean like Time magazine? For decades, campaigns have grappled with everything from anonymous calls claiming the election has been rescheduled to flyers spreading nasty smears about the candidates' families, and obviously fake memes to text your vote to a number that doesn't exist. But Trump's lies and conspiracy theories, the viral force of social media, and the involvement of foreign meddlers made disinformation a broader, deeper threat than the 2020 vote. Laura Quinn, a veteran progressive operative who co-founded Catalyst, began studying this problem a few years ago. She piloted a nameless secret project which she had never before publicly discussed that tracked disinformation online and tried to figure out how to combat it. One component was tracking dangerous lies that might otherwise spread unnoticed. Researchers then provided information to campaigners or the media to track down the sources and expose them. You know, one thing I think it's safe to argue that this article is doing is saying that the progressives are part of the mainstream, and it seems that those who call themselves progressive are have become part of the mainstream because the Justice Democrats, and you know I don't like using these ambiguous terms like progressive and whatnot, but the article seems to be mainstreaming the term progressive and saying, in sort of saying that subtle way that if you're not with the mainstream thought, then you're not progressive either. And then we have this talk about combating disinformation. Whenever people talk about combating disinformation, what they're really talking about is combating human nature. People are going to believe whatever they want to believe. That is their choice. That is their prerogative. That is part of being human. All you can ever do is present people with information and then let nature take its course. As I've discussed, why I became a teacher. You know, I don't know about you, but I miss when the Darwin Awards were actually funny. Well, let's continue. The most important takeaway from Quinn's research, however, was that engaging with toxic content only made it worse. When you get attacked, the instinct is to push back, call it out, and say, "This isn't true," Quinn says. But the more engagement something gets, the more platforms boost it. The more the algorithm reads it as, "Oh, this is popular, people want more of it." Okay. So what? Good ideas and bad ideas, popular or no. So what? All I see from Quinn so far is Quinn being a child in this article. The solution, she concluded, was to pressure platforms to enforce their rules by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation and by more aggressively policing it in the first place. The platforms have policies against certain types of malign behavior, but they haven't been enforcing them, she says. They have policies now. Many of these policies didn't exist before. Oh, I don't know, maybe a certain secretive cabal decided to get together and pressure the social media companies to act a certain way. Quinn's research gave ammunition to advocates pushing social media platforms to take a harder line. In November 2019, Mark Zuckerberg invited 9 civil rights leaders to dinner at his home, where they warned him about the danger of the election-related falsehoods that were already spreading unchecked. It took pushing, urging, conversations, and brainstorming, all of that to get to a place where we ended up with more rigorous rules and enforcement. says Vanita Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who attended the dinner and also met with Twitter Jack CEO, Oversized Gnome, Jack Dorsey and others. It took pushing, urging, conversations, brainstorming. Sounds like your ideas weren't very popular in the first place. Sounds like your ideas may not have been good ideas, which is why it took pushing, urging, conversations, and brainstorming. But then again, that's just one perspective. I could be completely wrong. And maybe they were good ideas. Good ideas that just weren't quote unquote sold right. But I'm not exactly sure what those ideas were now, am I? Does it say in this article? No, it just makes ambiguous references to these ideas. It was a struggle, but we got to the point where they understood the problem. Was it enough? Probably not. Was it later than we wanted? Yes. But it was really important, given the level of official disinformation, that they had these rules in place and were tagging things and taking them down. Beyond battling bad information, there was a need to explain a rapidly changing election process. It was crucial for voters to understand that despite what Trump was saying, mail-in votes weren't susceptible to fraud and that it would be normal, even if some states weren't finished counting votes on election night. I'm pretty sure Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the Supreme Court that said that mail-in ballots were highly susceptible to fraud. So, should I play the same card and say that since Time Magazine and the people that Time Magazine talked to don't believe that mail-in ballots aren't susceptible to any kind of election shenaniganery? Should I say that this means that they hate Ruth Bader Ginsburg? If she was indeed on the Supreme Court when that decision was reached, which I believe is the case, but I don't feel like looking it up now. But you get the idea. No, I'm not going to do that because I am not a blithering moron. Dick Gephardt. Wow. Okay, Dick Gephardt, the Democratic former House leader turned high-powered lobbyist, spearheaded one coalition. We wanted to get a really bipartisan group of former elected officials, cabinet secretaries, military leaders, and so on, aimed mainly at messaging to the public, but also speaking to local officials, the secretaries of state, attorneys general, governors who would be in the eye of the storm, to let them know we wanted to help, says Gephardt, who worked his contacts in the private sector to put $20 million behind the effort. Wamp, the former GOP congressman, worked through nonpartisan reform group Issue 1 to rally Republicans. We thought we should bring some bipartisan element of unity around what constitutes a free and fair election, Wamp says. The 22 Democrats and 22 Republicans on the National Council on Election Integrity met on Zoom at least once a week. They ran ads in 6 states, made statements, wrote articles, and alerted local officials to potential problems. We had rabid Trump supporters who agreed to serve on the council based on the idea that this was honest, Wamp says. This is going to be just as important, he told them, to convince the liberals when Trump wins, whichever way it cuts, we're going to stick together. That sounds interesting. We had Trump supporters who agreed to serve on the council based on the idea that it was honest. Does that mean that your intent was that it was dishonest? The Voting Rights Lab and Into Action created state-specific memes and graphics spread by email, text, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, urging that every vote be counted. Together, they were viewed more than 1 billion times. Protect Democracy's Election Task Force issued reports and held media briefings with high-profile experts across the political spectrum, resulting in widespread coverage of potential election issues and fact-checking of Trump's false claims. The organization's tracking polls found the message was being heard. The percentage of the public that didn't expect to know the winner on election night gradually rose until by late October it was over 70%. A majority also believed that a prolonged count wasn't the sign of problems. We knew exactly what Trump was going to do. He was going to try to use the fact that Democrats voted by mail and Republicans voted in person to make it look like he was ahead, claim victory, say that mail-in votes were fraudulent, and then try to get them thrown out, said Protect Democracy's Bassin. Setting public expectations ahead of time helped undercut those lies. The alliance took a common set of themes from the researcher Shankar Osorio presented at Podhorzer Zooms. The studies have shown that when people don't think their vote will count or fear casting it will be a hassle, they're far less likely to participate. Throughout election season, members of Podhorzer's group minimized incidents of voter intimidation and tamped down rising liberal hysteria about Trump's expected refusal to concede. They didn't want to amplify false claims by engaging them, or put people off voting by suggesting a rigged game. When you say these claims of fraud are spurious, what people hear is fraud, Shankar Osorio says. What we saw in our pre-election research was that anything that reaffirmed Trump's power or cast him as an authoritarian diminished people's desire to vote. Podhorzer, meanwhile, was warning everyone he knew that polls were underestimating Trump's support. The data he shared with media organizations who would be calling the election was tremendously useful to understand what was happening as the votes rolled in. According to a member of a major network's political unit who spoke with Podhorzer before Election Day, most analysts had recognized there would be a blue shift in key battlegrounds, the surge of votes breaking towards Democrats, driven by tallies of mail-in ballots, but they hadn't comprehended how much better Trump was likely to do on Election Day. Being able to document how big the absentee wave would be and the variance by state was essential, the analyst says. People power. The racial justice uprising sparked by George Floyd's killing in May was not primarily a political movement. The organizers who helped lead it wanted to harness its momentums for the election without allowing it to be co-opted by politicians. So much wrong here. Many of those organizers were part of Podhorzer's network, but the activists in battleground states who partnered with the Democracy Defense Coalition to organizations with leading roles in the movement for Black Lives. I don't know why people who were protesting a black man getting killed would vote for Biden or Harris. I've already gone into what they've done. It's all well and documented. It's all on public record. Not that I think that Trump was any better. In fact, I can't really say one way or another about Trump. But Biden-Harris, I would definitely not have voted for if I were black. The best way to ensure people's voices were heard, they decided, was to protect their ability to vote. We started thinking about a program that would complement the traditional election protection area, but also didn't rely on calling the police, says Nalini Stamp, the Working Families Party's national organizing director. They created a force of election defenders who, unlike traditional poll watchers, were trained in de-escalation techniques. During early voting and on Election Day, they surrounded lines of voters in urban areas with a joy to the polls effort that turned the act of casting a ballot into a street party. Black organizers who also recruited thousands of poll workers to ensure polling places would stay open in their communities. Creating the act of casting a ballot into a street party, so making a distraction? I don't know. What does that mean? The summer uprising had shown that people power could have a massive impact. Activists began preparing to reprise the demonstrations if Trump tried to steal the election. Americans planned widespread protests if Trump interferes with the election, Reuters reported in October, one of many such stories. More than 150 liberal groups, from the Women's March to the Sierra Club to Color of Change, from Democrats.com to the Democratic Socialists of America, joined the Protect the Results coalition. The group's now defunct website had a map listing 400 planned post-election demonstrations to be activated via text message as soon as November 4th. To stop the coup they feared, the left was ready to flood the streets. Sounds like partisan hackery. Even though they're claiming it was bipartisan, but most of these organizations seem very partisan, and they got a couple people from the Republican Party to join them, so that makes it nonpartisan. Interesting. Strange bedfellows. About a week before Election Day, Podhorzer received an unexpected message. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce wanted to talk. The AFL-CIO and the Chamber have a long history of antagonism. Though neither organization is explicitly partisan, the influential business lobby has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Republican campaigns, just as the nation's unions funnel hundreds of millions to Democrats. On one side is labor, on the other management, locked in an internal struggle for power and resources. But behind the scenes, the business community was engaged in its own anxious discussions about how the election and its aftermath might unfold. The summer's racial justice protests had sent a signal to business owners too, the potential for economy disrupting civil disorder. With tensions running high, there was a lot of concern about unrest around the election, or a breakdown in our normal way we could handle contentious elections. Let me read that again. With tensions running high, there was a lot of concern about unrest around the election, or a breakdown our normal way in our normal way we handle contentious elections. There we go, says Neil Bradley, the Chamber's Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. These worries had led the Chamber to release a pre-election statement with the Business Roundtable, a Washington-based CEOs group, as well as associations of manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, calling for patience and confidence as votes were counted. But Bradley wanted to send a broader, more bipartisan message. He reached out to Podhorzer through an intermediary both men declined to name. Agreeing that their unlikely alliance would be powerful, they began to discuss a joint statement pledging their organization's shared commitment to a fair and peaceful election. They would choose their words carefully and scheduled the statement's release for maximum impact. As it was being finalized, Christian leaders signaled their interest in joining, further broadening its reach. At this point, I'm wondering if you're having the same ideas that I'm having. The statement was released on Election Day under the names of Chamber CEO Thomas Donahue, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, and the heads of the National Association of Evangelicals and the National African American Clergy Network. It is imperative that election officials be given the space and time to count every vote in accordance with applicable laws, it stated. We call on the media, the candidates, and the American people to exercise patience with the process and trust in our system, even if it requires more time than usual. But you didn't have trust in our system, did you? Which is why you went through all this. Why would you tell people to have trust in your system when you explicitly state that you don't trust the system? The groups added, although we may not always agree on the desired outcomes up and down the ballot, we are united in our call for the American democratic process to proceed without violence, intimidation, or any other tactic that makes us weaker as a nation. Showing up, standing down. Election night began with many Democrats despairing. Trump was running ahead of pre-election polling, winning Florida, Ohio, and Texas easily, and keeping Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania too close to call. But Podhorzer was unperturbed when I spoke to him that night. The returns were exactly in line with his modeling. He had been warning for weeks that Trump's voters' turnout was surging. As the Trump numbers dribbled out, he could tell as long as the votes were counted, Trump would lose. The Liberal Alliance gathered for an 11 p.m. Zoom call. Hundreds joined. Many were freaking out. It was really important for me and the team in that moment to help ground people in what we had already known was true, says Angela Peoples, director for Democracy Defense Coalition. Podhorzer presented the data to show the group that victory was in hand. While he was talking, Fox News surprised everyone by calling Arizona for Biden. The public awareness campaign had worked. TV anchors were bending over backwards to counsel caution and frame the vote count accurately. The question then became what to do next. The conversation that followed was a difficult one, led by the activists charged with the protest strategy. We wanted to be mindful of when it was the right time to call for moving masses of people into the street, People says. As much as they were eager to mount a show of strength, mobilizing immediately could backfire and put people at risk. Like on January 6th? Protests that devolved into violent clashes will give Trump a pretext to send in federal agents or troops as he had over the summer. You mean like protests that involved people breaking into the Capitol, which led to giving people a reason to erect a fence around the area and make it an exclusionary zone. So now I have to call it the Citadel instead of the Capitol. And rather than elevate Trump's complaints by continuing to fight him, the alliance wanted to send a message that the people had spoken. So the word went out: stand down, protect the results, announced that it would not be activating the entire national mobilization network today, but remains ready to activate if necessary. On Twitter, outraged progressives wondered what was going on. Why wasn't anyone trying to stop Trump's coup? Where were all the protests? Podhorzer credits the activists for their restraint. They hadn't spent much time getting ready to hit the streets on Wednesday, but they did it, he says. Wednesday through Friday, there was not a single Antifa versus Proud Boys incident like everyone was expecting. And when it didn't materialize, I think the Trump campaign had a backup plan. I don't think the Trump campaign had a backup plan. Activists reoriented the Protect the Results protest toward a weekend of celebration. Counter their disinfo with our confidence and get ready to celebrate. Oh, sure. What do we want to qualify this one as? The Dunning-Kruger effect or the Milgram effect? Read the messaging guidance Cenk Osorio presented to the Liberal Alliance on Friday, November 6th. Just read this card with all the talking points and don't try to think too much about it. Declare and fortify our win. Vibe: confident, forward-looking, unified, not passive, anxious. The voters, not the candidates, would be the protagonists of the story. It sounds like the voters are not the protagonists of this story, though. The planned day of celebration happened to coincide with the election being called on November 7th. Activists dancing in the street of Philadelphia blasted Beyonce over an attempted Trump campaign press conference. The Trumpers' next confab was scheduled for 4 seasons total landscaping outside the city center, which activists believe was not a coincidence. The people of Philadelphia own the streets of Philadelphia, crows the Working Families Party Mitchell. We made them look ridiculous by contrasting our joyous celebration of democracy with their clown show. The votes had been counted, Trump had lost, but the battle wasn't over. The 5 steps to victory. In Podhorzer's presentations, winning the vote was only the first step to winning the election. After that came winning the count, winning the certification, winning the Electoral College, and winning the transition. Steps that were normally formalities, but he knew Trump would see as opportunities for disruption. Nowhere would there be more evident than in Michigan, where Trump's pressure on local Republicans came perilously close to working, and where liberal and conservative pro-democracy forces joined to counter it. It was around 10 p.m. on election night in Detroit when a flurry of texts lit up the phone of Art Reyes III. A busload of Republican election observers had arrived at TCF Center where votes were being tallied. They were crowding the vote counting tables, refusing to wear masks, heckling the mostly black workers. Oh my, that is just so low. Reyes, a Flint native who leads We the People Michigan, was expecting this. For months, conservative groups have been sowing suspicion about urban vote fraud. Maybe he was expecting it because it's required by law that members of the opposing party are supposed to be there as observers. The language was, they're going to steal the election and there will be fraud in Detroit, long before any vote was cast, Reyes says. Let's look at this. Trump supporters seek to disrupt the vote count at Detroit's DCF Center on November 4th. Observers are part of the ballot process. He made his way to the arena and sent word to his network. Within 45 minutes, dozens of reinforcements have arrived. As they entered the arena to provide a counterweight to the GOP observers inside, Reyes took down their cell phone numbers and added them to a massive text chain. Racial justice activists from Detroit Will Breathe worked alongside suburban women from Femmes for Dems and local elected officials. Reyes left at 3 a.m., handing the text chain over to a disability activist. As they mapped out the steps in the election certification process, activists settled on a strategy of foregrounding the people's right to decide, demanding their voices be heard, and calling attention to the racial implications of disenfranchising black Detroiters. They flooded the Wayne County canvassing board's November 17th certification meeting with on-message testimony. Despite a Trump tweet, the Republican board members certified Detroit's voices. So they went there, they read scripted lines. Election boards were one pressure point. Another was GOP-controlled legislatures, who Trump believed could declare the election void and appoint their own electors. And so the president invited the GOP leaders of the Michigan legislature, House Speaker Lee Chatfield and Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey, to Washington on November 20th. It was a perilous moment. If Chatfield and Shirkey agreed to do Trump's bidding, Republicans in other states might be similarly bullied. I was concerned things were going to get weird, says Jeff Timmer, a former Michigan GOP chair turned anti-Trump activist. Norm Eisen describes it as the scariest moment of the entire election. The Democracy Defenders launched a full-court press. Protect Democracy's local contacts researched the lawmakers' personal and political motives. They doxed them. Issue 1 ran... I'm not saying that they doxed them, I'm just translating that from this text. That's what it seems like they're saying to me, that they doxed them. Issue 1 ran television ads in Lansing. The Chambers Bradley kept close tabs on the process. Wamp, the former Republican congressman, called his former colleagues Mike Rogers, who wrote an op-ed for the Detroit newspapers urging officials to honor the will of the voters. 3 former Michigan governors, Republicans John Engler and Rick Snyder, and Democrat Jennifer Granholm, jointly called for Michigan's electoral votes to be cast free of pressure from the White House. Engler, a former head of the Business Roundtable, made phone calls to influential donors and fellow GOP elder statesmen who could press the lawmakers privately. The pro-democracy forces were up against a Trumpified Michigan GOP controlled by allies of Ronna McDaniel, the Republican National Committee chair, and Betsy DeVos, the former education secretary and member of a billionaire family of GOP donors. On a call with his team on November 18th, Bosson vented that his side's pressure was no match for what Trump could offer. Of course, he was going to offer them something, Bosson recalls thinking. Head of the Space Force, ambassador to whatever. We can't compete with that by offering carrots. We need a stick. What an interesting line. Of course, Trump's going to offer people positions. Let's look at the recent appointees by the Biden administration, shall we? Is there anything different going on by one side or another? I think not. We can't compete by offering carrots. We need a stick. So instead of offering incentive, you're going to offer pain. My. So heroic. I guess the beatings will continue until morale improves. If Trump were to offer something in exchange for a personal favor, what would likely constitute bribery, Basson reasoned. He phoned Richard Primus, a law professor at the University of Michigan, to see if Primus agreed and would make the argument publicly. Well, guess what? It would be bribery if you did it as well. If you were in the same position. I mean, what you're doing now could almost be considered bribery if you're offering people carrots to do things. Let's go back and read that again. We can't compete with that by offering carrots. You know, that statement right there sounds like bribery. Our bribery is not as good as his bribery. We need to do something else. He phoned Richard Primus. I read that. Primus said he thought the meeting itself was inappropriate and got to work on an op-ed for Politico, warning that the state attorney general, a Democrat, would have no choice but to investigate. When the piece posted on November 19th, the Attorney General's communications director tweeted it. Protect Democracy soon got word that the lawmakers plan to bring lawyers to the meeting with Trump the next day. Reyes activists scanned flight schedules and flocked to the airports on both ends of Shirky's journey to D.C. to underscore the lawmakers were being scrutinized. You're stalking them. That's your tactic. We're going to stalk people. After the meeting, the pair announced they pressed the president and delivered COVID relief for their constituents and informed him that they saw no role in the election process. They went for a drink. Then they went for a drink at the Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. A street artist projected their images onto the outside of the building along with the words, "The world is watching." That left one last step. Wow, that sounds like some really major intimidation right there. Now, let me be clear, dear frenemy. I'm not going to say that one person doing it is good and another person doing it is bad. I'm just going to call it like I see it. I mean, going out and hovering around a governor who decides, you know what, we should have a family dinner at a nice restaurant while everybody else is forced to stay at home is not a measure of intimidation. I'm just pointing out like things being alike. That left one last step. The state canvassing board, made up of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. One Republican, a Trumper employed by the DeVos family's political nonprofit, was not expected to vote for the certification. The other Republican on the board was a little-known lawyer named Aaron Van Langeveld. He sent no signals about what he planned to do, leaving everyone on edge. When the meeting began, Reyes activists flooded the live stream and filled Twitter with their hashtag #AllEyesOnMe. A board accustomed to attendance in the single digits suddenly faced an audience of thousands. In hours of testimony, the activists emphasized their message of respecting voters' wishes and affirming democracy rather than scolding the officials. Van Langeveld quickly signaled that he would follow precedent. The vote was 3-0 to certify. The other Republican abstained. After that, the dominoes fell. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the rest of the states certified their electors. Republican officials in Arizona and Georgia stood up to Trump's bullying, and the Electoral College voted on schedule on December 14th. Yeah, but who stood up to the bullying of these people? How close we came. There was one last milestone on Podhorser's mind, January 6th. On the day Congress would meet to tally the electoral count, Trump summoned his supporters to D.C. for a rally. Much to their surprise, 1,000 who answered his call were met by virtually no counter-demonstrators. To preserve safety and ensure they couldn't be blamed for any mayhem, the activist left was strenuously discouraging counter-activity. Podhorser texted me on the morning of January 6th with a cross-fingers emoji. Trump addressed the crowd that afternoon, peddling the lie that lawmakers or Vice President Mike Pence could reject states' electoral votes. That's not a lie, that's in the Constitution. He told them to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. Then he returned to the White House as they sacked the building. That is also a lie. The rioters broke in while he was still in the middle of his speech. Okay, let me be clear. That's not a lie. That is technically correct, but the implication is that they went into the Capitol building after Trump spoke, when in fact the people that broke into the Capitol building did so as he was speaking. As lawmakers fled for their lives and his own supporters were shot and trampled, Trump praised the rioters as very special. What? Just, wow. Okay. In his final attack on democracy, and once again, it was his final attack on democracy, and once again, it failed. This is making the implication that Trump told people to go storm the building. He did not. By standing down, the democracy campaigners outfoxed their foes. We won by the skin of our teeth, honestly, and that's an important point for folks to sit with, says the Democracy Defense Coalition's peoples. There's an impulse for some to say that voters decided and democracy won, but it's a mistake to think that this election cycle was a show of strength for democracy. Yes, it is a mistake to think that this election cycle was a show of strength for democracy. It shows how vulnerable democracy is. Yes. And we are close to the end. Members of the alliance to protect the election have gone their separate ways. The Democracy Defense Coalition has been disbanded, and though the fight back table lives on. Protect Democracy and the good government advocates have turned their attention on pressing reforms in Congress. Left-wing activists are pressuring the newly empowered Democrats to remember the voters who put them there, while civil rights groups are on guard against further attacks on voting. Oh, this is just hilarious, where the heroes are all riding into the sunset. I'm barely able to contain my laughter. Business leaders denounced the January 6th attack, and some say they will no longer donate to lawmakers who refuse to certify Biden's victory. Podhorzer and his allies are still holding their Zoom strategy sessions, gouging voters' views and developing new messages. And Trump is in Florida, facing his second impeachment, deprived of the Twitter and Facebook accounts he used to push the nation to its breaking points. How so? As I was reporting this article in November and December, I heard different claims about who should get the credit for thwarting Trump's plot. The liberals argue that the role of bottom-up people power shouldn't be overlooked, particularly the contributions of people of color and local grassroots activists. Others stress the heroism of GOP officials like Van Langeveld and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who stood up to Trump at considerable cost. The truth is that neither likely could have succeeded without the other. It's astounding how close we came, how fragile all this really is, says Timmer, the former Michigan GOP chair. It is like Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff, and if you don't look down, you don't fall. Our democracy only survives if we all believe and don't look down. Wow, what a line. So, Timmer is saying that democracy doesn't exist in this country, but if you believe it's there, then you'll somehow be okay? What a crock of shit. Democracy won in the end, did it? The will of the people prevailed, did it? But it's crazy. In retrospect, this is what it took to put on election in the United States of America. So, dear frenemy, I hope that was a fun fairy tale for you all. I enjoyed it. And yes, these events may be true, but I would argue that many of them are heavily skewed, and a lot of things are not being said. But there's a lesson in this story. What is the lesson in this story? Well, hopefully you've determined that by now. So, let's see what the title of this article was again. I forget. Oh yes, the title of this article. You know, whatever the winners do is okay as long as the winners do it. That's the title of the article. One thing you're probably thinking is that the ends justify the means, but that is a very misquoted statement. The actual statement is that one must consider the ends when determining the means. And if the ends mean by your revelation of manipulating information and pressuring people is that you're no better than the other guy, then what leg do you really have to stand on, dear frenemy?